My wife is afraid of the police. Submitted to r/nolseep by T. Crandall. It's nice where we live now, a quiet town in the hills. Nothing like the city my wife Leslie and I first lived in together. The only homeless out here are just backpackers making their way through the nearby forest. And the police force are the kind of Mayberry nice that television used to promise they'd be. That was what Leslie wanted when we left the city, not that being here seemed to help her much. She still keeps the doors locked, and I can see her trap muscles bulge whenever a black and white cruiser pulls in behind us. Personally, there isn't any problem with anything out here for me. I guess you might say I kind of miss the homeless, and for my part, I drive down to the city once a month and put a little effort in at a shelter. There isn't a lot that I can do. I'm a stay-at-home graphic designer, so what I accomplish are the menial tasks. But it helps, well, they say that it helps. And whenever I can, I donate some reusable water bottles, something to keep the homeless hydrated when it gets hot out. Leslie considers this one of my cuter habits, up there with singing in the shower and affecting a British accent whenever I drink a cup of tea. I didn't always care that much about the homeless, the same way Leslie didn't used to be afraid of the police, like when we first moved in together on XYZ Street. And, if you came to our apartment, you would have understood why I didn't care much for the homeless. We did a lot to make that apartment feel nice, but when you find a bargain in a nice neighborhood in a big city, there is going to be something wrong. That first apartment my wife, well, girlfriend at the time, but that first apartment that we shared had several issues. Primarily was our landlord, Greg, who never met a job that couldn't be handled by a guy. Not a plumber, carpenter, painter, or anything with a license number on the side of a pickup truck, always just a guy in an unmarked, multicolored, mostly dented car. Because Greg was always hiring out guys when things went wrong, it meant nothing ever really got fixed. The bathtub glazing was always being redone. Paint on the exterior always seemed to bubble up and chip away right after it was applied. There were random screws poking out of newer pieces of trim. And the spigot for a hose that was long gone always seemed to be dripping water into the alley out back. The other problem with our apartment was the condominium complex a few blocks down, under the overpass. Cardboard Commons was what I called it one night, drunkenly commenting on the situation to Leslie and our friends, because it looked like a sprawling complex of cardboard stalls set up on the sidewalks, not unlike cheap townhomes for the young professionals. The stench on some nights was so bad you could practically smell it from our apartment. While I was making a joke out of the situation, Leslie was busy getting progressively more irritated. They or them were a distant problem, but edging nearer and nearer as the dripping spigot got worse and the paint chipped a little more, and we became increasingly aware that bargain hunting for a home was perhaps a questionable decision. But, at the time, Leslie was locked into an ironclad contract for her first job at an absolutely terrible hospital right out of nursing school, and if we could make it 15 months, she would be a certified emergency nurse with a year and a half of experience. So, they and them were allowed to creep a little closer to our apartment month after month. You could hear shouting some nights, as one person chased another away from the tarpaulin sprawl, demanding money, or drugs, or alcohol, or some other payment for a wrong, real or imagined. Looking out the window some mornings would allow you to watch a shuffling outcast making their way towards the beach encampment, forever exiled from the rain-protected overpass for a violation of a code I will hopefully never need to learn. More than once, Leslie called the police to file complaints, noise complaints, general complaints, that sort of thing. Only once did a cruiser even bother coming out, but only to tell her that the homeless being homeless wasn't something they wanted to come out for. Once a week, my wife would bitch about the police, but most nights, it was just complaints about the questionable quality of her coworkers and hospital at large. Things started to get strange in November, 7 months away from the end of Leslie's contract. It might have been earlier or later, but only by a couple of weeks. I remember it distinctly because the light was getting dimmer sooner and brighter later, and Leslie would go to work in the darkness and come home in the darkness, and I would spend what little daylight there was working from the office that I had built in our second bedroom. The extra long dark must have emboldened some members of the nearby community to wander further from home, because Leslie began to notice that the spigot in the alley had a large pool of water in front of it each morning when she left for the hospital. Sometimes there would be trash beside it, cigarette packets, Slim Jim wrappers, cheap makeup, or beer bottles. "Those bastards," was my compassionate nurse's reply. "Greg is going to put a lock on that spigot, I'll make him." But Greg sent a guy to look into doing that. And the guy said it couldn't be done. The love of my life called the police, who told her that if she ever saw somebody using the spigot to call back, but they weren't exactly prepared to park a cruiser in our alley for sentry purposes. Leslie's next obsession was convincing Greg to put a gate up. The spigot was just off the alley, right in the small pathway that led from the door of our apartment to the alley in the rear and the sidewalk around the front. In theory, Leslie's theory, putting a gate at both ends would prevent them from getting onto the property and using the spigot, and she would outline all the ways it would help, and then tell me about how poorly the doors fit at her job, and be at peace complaining about work. Greg decided this gate idea was worth looking into, but never really clarified what that meant, or if there was even a guy who could look into it. While he was investigating all options, the situation became increasingly concerning for Leslie. Some days she would see the vague and huddled shapes of the homeless people trying to wash up using a hoseless spigot in a narrow walkway. Hey! The bark, commanding and tense, was loud enough to wake me if I wasn't already up. Hey! You can't be here. And then silence until she got home at night and mentioned that if I was ever up when she was shouting that, I should call the police. Maybe then they'd take this a little more seriously. She would growl over an open bottle of beer. And then she would tell me about whatever nurse or doctor or tech at work got on her nerves that day. One morning, right around mid-December, I got up with Leslie and cooked us a breakfast of eggs and French toast. It was maybe a day or two after her birthday, her first shift after, and it was a little surprise meant to make her day brighter. Of course, she spent most of the breakfast stewing on whether or not she would have to shout at a homeless person. It had become such an obsession that at this point that she complained about the homeless more than the hospital that she worked at. I remember watching her stare into the middle distance while chewing a syrup-logged cube of toast and beginning to question, "Can't you just?" But when her eyes shot up and tried to pierce mine, I let the question trail off because it became immediately and abundantly clear that she could not just. After breakfast, Leslie pulled her scrubs on and grabbed her bag while I started the dishes. She paused for a brief moment at the sink by the door to give me a kiss and then left into the cold and dark morning air. There was a pause, a long enough pause for me to realize that she had not closed the door as quickly as she should have, before I heard that whisper, the one that makes you stop what you're doing for fear the world is going to catch fire. "Tom." "What?" "Tom." I followed her gaze to the end of our walkway. There, hunched over by the spigot, was a shadowy silhouette of a homeless woman. I don't know what it was about it right then that convinced me it was a woman, because the shadow was just jagged shapes of baggy clothes over a bony frame and hair that hadn't been properly washed in years. I could hear the water running, echoing off of the cinder block wall on the other side of the walkway, but not a single splash or change in tone like a hand or body part being put beneath the stream. Well, I nodded pensively, thinking about how water is one of those things you need to live. Maybe she's going too. "Hey." Leslie stepped into the walkway, stomping down the concrete path. "Hey." The shadow drifted in the pre-dawn darkness, seeming to shift onto its far leg. "You can't do that here." Leslie pointed at the thing in the walkway, then pointed again, forcefully. "You need to go." At the end of the walkway, the shadow seemed almost like a projection, slowly distorting as it oozed onto the far wall. "My boyfriend is calling the cops." Leslie cried out, "Better go before they show up." That was what did it, the threat of police intervention. The shadow moved with a greater purpose and began to melt into the alley, with one leg dragging weakly behind the other, and its shoulders pitched forward. Am I actually calling the cops on a bathing homeless woman? Yes. Leslie cast a sidelong glance at me, and chomped down on the corner of her mouth, "And even if she's gone, you're going to file a report. She stole our water." Leslie walked down the pathway and tried turning off the still-flowing spigot, but howled out in failure after a moment. "And she broke the damn faucet." I waited for the police on the back steps, nursing a cup of coffee. It felt like overkill to call the police even after shutting the water valve that fed the spigot and another like it in the front. The poor woman was just trying to drink, or bathe, or do something else that we had the ability to take for granted even in our crappy little apartment. And I wondered what Greg would say in response to my email about the broken spigot, and what kind of guy he would send to fix the problem. The officer showed up an hour later, and she apologized for the late response, citing shift change in daily briefings and all the yada yada, I think she said. She was pleasant and courteous and very smiley, maybe a year or two older than Leslie and I. But she moved with absolute confidence, checking the nooks around the apartment before lifting the lids on the massive trash cans to look inside. "They're doing this thing lately," she smiled at me as she lifted the lids of the cans, hiding in the cans. "We call it Oscar the Grouching." Sounds dangerous. Usually not. But, she bobbed her head side to side, sometimes. A few years ago one of them got shot around here. Why? Acting shady. Poking around where she shouldn't be. Causing problems, being threatening. We gotta do something about it. She put a finger gun out and let the recoil lift her pointer finger in the air. You know? I guess I don't. I hope you don't need to, sir, she shrugged. I can start a report about the, spigot, but your landlord will have to finish up with us about it at the station. Can he send a guy to do it for him? Her smile doubled, and she let a little chuckle slip. One of those landlords, eh? I raised and dropped my eyebrows with a curl of my lips. Yeah, I got one of those myself. If you want my advice, next time, no matter what's happening, and as she said it, the officer dropped a hand onto her handgun, make it sound like they're being violent with you. Is that really wise? If you put it like that, she raised her sunglasses and winked, I can come a little sooner just for you. I see. She let her sunglasses fall back onto her nose. I'll try to cruise through here every hour or so, and ask the other shifts to do the same. Usually, after a place has a lot of cops for a few days, anybody with any kind of sense just moves on. Let's hope so. I raised my eyebrows. My girlfriend absolutely can't stand all these encounters. Not everybody can. The officer took a step towards me. It takes someone special, Mr. Crandall, but I just go by Tom. Thanks, Tom Crandall. The officer slapped my shoulder. Stay safe and, call if you need me. That night, Leslie rolled her eyes while listening to my retelling of the story. She seemed to think that the officer was just hoping I'd be waiting for her if she drove back through again. But, my guess is she was still angry that the spigot was leaking water and Greg's guy couldn't look at it for a week. The next morning, Greg knocked on the door to the walkway a little after 10, wrench in one hand and a tired look on his face. I put a cap on that spigot, he sighed, then tilted his head and let his hand rise and fall. I don't know what Leslie thinks I'm gonna do about the homeless, Tom. I'm not able to sit back here all day with a shotgun or something. No, I know, Greg. I appreciate it anyway. Leslie is getting paranoid. She even thought about getting some cameras. If she wants, he shrugged again. Well, stay safe. We will. My morning started to get on track after that. Some music, some work. Around 11:30, I went to get one last cup of coffee but stopped in the middle of the living room. See, the office was in the back of the apartment, and the kitchen was right by the door to the walkway, just off the living room. On any given day, you could see the sunlight coming through the kitchen window while walking through the living room. But that morning, in the middle of the polygonal light was a silhouette. Whip-thin, and jagged. A hand reached up into the light, with long bony fingers that distorted wider as they disappeared into the edge of the light. Someone was standing at the door, with its big square window, peering in. I crept back to the office and took my phone off the desk, dialing the emergency number calmly and then waiting for the answer while I dug an old pocket knife out of my desk. 911, a flat voice wheezed. Where is your emergency? 2387, XYZ Street. I cracked, my voice moving more than I thought it should, struggling to figure out if the knife would help me. There's a homeless person at my back door, and I think they're trying to break in. Are you in a safe place? Yes, no, I'm inside. They're not in yet, but, I think. Okay, sir, I have a squad car in the area. Stay on the line with me and tell me if they get in the door. Yes, I can do that. I can. I took a deep breath and looked at the knife and decided to put it down, like a 3-inch knife that had only opened packages would do anything to help me. Can you describe their appearance? Thin, I didn't. I thought about the officer from yesterday. I think they may have been hanging around here yesterday, but I didn't get a good look. Did the individual threaten you in any way? No, I thought about the officer's advice. No, nothing like that. Okay, sir. There was a pause that felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. My squad car is reporting that they are in the alley rear. Would you like to stay on the line until the officer makes contact? They're outside? Already? Yes, and they're reporting that they do not see. Hold on, a pause. They're stating there is nobody outside at present. Thank you. I let out a deep breath as I heard knocking on the back door. Thank you so much. You are welcome, the operator robotically intoned and then clicked the receiver down. There was more knocking at the door. I set the phone and the knife on the desk and walked into the kitchen, where the same officer from the day before was standing at the door. She saw me approaching in my shorts and graphic tee and gave a wave, just a waggle of her fingers, as she lifted her glasses. I just smiled slightly and gave a nod as I unlocked the door and opened it. Is that a homeless woman in your alley? She questioned, or are you just anxious to see me? Homeless woman, I chose, thinking about Leslie's complaints, Scary looking one. Same one? I shrugged, realizing I never bothered to peek around the corner at the door. I think so. Standing at this window? Ah, the officer grinned, looking around the kitchen and at the national park posters on the wall. She see anything good? Anything good? Her grin got wider at first, before she narrowed it down to two pursed lips. Just, yeah, hey, you didn't mention any violence? They didn't seem very vile. Woman standing at your back door looking in, the officer winked. She wants something and it seems she's coming to take it. I wouldn't be sure about that. Ah, she nodded, lowering her sunglasses. Well, if you'd like I could come in and file a report. That won't be. I figured. Just, offering. Protecting. Serving. Thank you, officer. Tate. Tate, she added her name to the title, even though I remember clearly putting a period after it. I'm in this area all week, ready to help out if there's anybody at your back door. Remember, I can come a little bit faster if it sounds a little bit rougher. Round the station, I'm known for the rough stuff. Thank you, Officer Tate. I will call if anything, I realized what I was saying too late to stop, comes up. You do that, she smiled, then pointed the same finger she pretended to use as a gun right at my chest. Tom, right? Yep. Tom, she nodded, stepping away from the door. Call if you need anything, or if they come back. I smiled, closing the door without a word and praying that she didn't turn around to say anything else. As soon as she was gone, I stood in the kitchen a minute, then slid my shoes on, grabbed my keys, and headed for the car. I drove to the nearest electronics store and bought several of those do-it-yourself camera kits. Now, the whole time I was doing it, I was thinking that I wasn't even really protecting myself from the homeless anymore because Officer Tate seemed very eager to do that for me. At that moment, I was protecting myself from Leslie, who would probably not be too happy knowing the same officer was hanging around our apartment, hoping I would get her to come sooner with rougher stuff. My boss didn't really care that I got nothing done that afternoon because we were between projects. He even helped me check the field of view on the cameras remotely. I mounted one of them facing the alley and looking down the walkway, another looking down the walkway towards the street, and then a third looking directly at the rear door. I thought about how happy Leslie would be knowing all the angles were covered. And she was, when she got home. She had a few choice words about Officer Tate, who soon became a subject of her growing rants against the police force and the homeless. Leslie began to hypothesize that the police and the homeless had an agreement. There could be one in our alley or the other, but never both. Over the next few days, I learned that store-bought security cameras are far from perfect. The tiniest gust of wind was enough to get the motion activation going, and there were dozens of videos of nothing at all every day, along with our neighbors, cats, and even a few raccoons poking around the walkway. Leslie thought that the police were taking their job more seriously after all her emails, and every day she reported seeing a squad car within a block of our apartment, sometimes even cruising through the alley as she stepped down our walkway. I could see on the cameras that the car that followed her was always driven by a young blonde woman. At first, I put my woke cap on and figured that there could be more than one blonde female cop. Until the evening that the cop got out and started talking to Leslie. My phone notified me of movement on one camera, and I opened it just in time to see that the blonde cop was Officer Tate, standing in the walkway, conversing with my girlfriend. Then, after a brief exchange, Leslie began walking back to the apartment while Tate watched with one hand covering that holster. My girlfriend was thrilled to tell me how seriously the police were taking our problem, dropping her backpack on the table with the first relieved sigh I heard in weeks. This officer just stopped in to check on me and see if I've seen any. Officer Tate? Yes? Leslie lowered her eyebrows. Who is that, the bitch? Yeah, that's Tate. She's the one that's always following me. Leslie's eyes exploded. She asked me which apartment I live in. Well, she prob. Oh, I am going straight to the watch commander about this shit. I'm sure Leslie absolutely let the watch commander have it, but I never heard that phone call. For another week or so, she complained more about the cops than the homeless, and then it went back to splitting her gripes equally between the two. I stopped hearing about the hospital altogether. I was walking to get more coffee one morning, and I saw that same shadow cast across the floor. Thin and ragged, and obviously the homeless woman looking through the window. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and opened the app for the cameras. All I needed was a good description of the woman and to see if she was armed. Then, if she wasn't armed, I could try to reason with her. And if she couldn't be reasoned with, or if she was armed, Then I just had to make it through one more encounter with Officer Tate, and then this would all blow over. But there wasn't anybody on the cameras. The wind had activated them, but nobody was standing at the door. And by the time I looked up from my camera, the shadow was gone. I turned the corner into the kitchen, and there was nobody standing in the window or visible in the walkway. But I thought, maybe she's in the walkway, maybe she's still where I can find her, and I went into the walkway barefoot and unarmed. "Hey!" And the silence answered. As I looked to the street and the alley and wondered where she could have gone, a squad car rolled to a stop in the alley. Before I could begin to dread the encounter, I heard the voice. "Oh. Hey there, Tom." I looked over my shoulder, checking that there was nobody lurking in the bushes near my open door, and began to walk part way down the alley as I prepared to tell Officer Tate something. A sort of Dear John letter like, "Dear Brianna, please stop following my wife and lurking in my alley waiting to fuck me, shoot a homeless woman, or both. Officer Tate, I." "Shit," she called out. Before I could even see her hop out of the car, "I gotta run, see ya, Tom." I heard a mechanical clang as the squad car shifted into gear and sped off, then the siren starting in the distance, and I let out a sigh of relief before returning to the apartment, with the spigot loudly gurgling as it dumped water on the ground behind me, broken yet again. Once I was back inside with a cup of coffee, the hard work of checking every camera and every angle began. There was nothing, not a single person besides myself and the faint image of the squad car in the alley. But the wind had been moving the cameras the whole time, triggering their motion sensors even though it was barely blowing on the walkway. But I guess it was strong enough, because Leslie came home that night and thought that the pillows on the couch had been moved and some mail on the coffee table. She seemed less pleased with all that after I told her about the shadows and Officer Tate and the cameras not catching anything. "You know, I think I'm going to call the watch commander again," she smirked as she said it. "They can't keep those homeless away and that bitch is always skulking around. If you think it'll help." Well, if nothing else, we know from the camera that there isn't any real threat from these homeless anymore. So this Tate bitch can maybe focus on keeping them in the cardboard commons. "Yeah," I nodded, "bet she can." At the time, the watch commander did not seem to be particularly helpful, as he said that Officer Tate had not been assigned to our area in several days. Beyond that, Leslie said he thought we would appreciate Officer Tate being the most likely to respond, citing her ability to handle these kinds of situations very well in the past. I kept quiet as Leslie told me all about how the police do very little to help, refraining from mentioning that I felt that very few people do anything to help the homeless. Including, as an example, the woman who insisted on getting the police involved in the first place. While Leslie let herself stew over the lack of helpfulness, I became obsessed with the part about Tate handling these situations in the past. After all, if that wasn't cryptic, then nothing ever would be. December turned into January, and paranoia began to set in. The cameras always seemed to be tripped by the wind. Leslie insisted that there was a squad car at the end of our block almost all of the time. I didn't mention that I could see Tate on the alley camera at least once a week, walking a few feet down our walkway before leaving, and I worked very hard to keep those videos deleted. Which was easy enough, since the constant notifications made it impossible for Leslie to keep track of all of them. But the whole thing was taking its toll on Leslie anyway. She kept insisting things were being moved around in the apartment, and as time wore on, we both became more tense. There always seemed to be something scraping, dragging, somewhere. Shadows never looked quite like they lined up to me. The spigot kept getting fixed and then leaking again, and even the faucets inside the apartment began to drip. And every time there was a siren in the distance, I could see Leslie's shoulders get tight. Around the end of January, I went down to the police headquarters. After some calling around with a calmer voice than I ever heard Leslie use, I learned that I could get a copy of Officer Tate's record for 10 cents a page. With Leslie saying that the squad car always felt closer, I figured if nothing else, we could read every complaint and laugh about it and maybe feel like Officer Tate was just a little less of a threat. That wasn't exactly what I learned. According to the file, Officer Tate was a 4-year veteran of the force, with 10 use of force complaints on her record and 2 officer-involved shootings. She punched a 17-year-old boy in the face and broke his nose, tased a dog, and once made a single father lay face down in a damp gutter for 40 minutes while she searched his car. During one incident involving 10 cops in a high-speed chase, she was one of 8 officers who discharged a firearm. Most interestingly though, she was the one that shot the homeless woman a few years before this all started. And she shot her in the alley right behind our apartment. Then bragged about it while making it sound like someone else did it. The report stated that Officer Tate was on routine patrol when she spotted the woman drinking from the water spigot. She attempted to contact the individual who then, and I'm quoting the report here, flew at her with her claw-like fingernails, attempting to choke Officer Tate and beat the officer across the face and chest. 8 shots to the center of mass on a 90-pound 16-year-old runaway. She was dead when the ambulance got there. And when I was reading that report, waiting for Leslie to come home, I noticed the shadow of a hand on the page for a moment, pointing to the name of the young woman, Jessie F. I thought the paranoia was getting to me. The file went into my desk, and I decided not to tell Leslie about it, which turned out to be for the best. Leslie blew into the apartment like a hurricane that night, angry tears in her eyes and her chest heaving with her shoulders. I can't believe that bitch. Who? Fucking Tate. Leslie stomped to the bedroom, tossing her backpack on the couch. She just gave me a fucking ticket. Failing to signal, can you believe it? No, but... What? I realized I shouldn't have started, but there wasn't much sense stopping. But did you signal? Yes, I fucking signaled. Leslie was letting the tears run onto her cheeks. She said she didn't see it. She said a bunch of other stuff too, mean stuff. Like what? She was saying that she didn't know what you saw in me, and she said she thought our time was coming up. I shook my head. She sounds crazy. Yeah, Leslie sniffled, and then she raised her eyebrows at me. Yeah, but... She didn't continue the thought, staring at me with a tear in her eye. But what? Why does the stuff keep moving? The stuff? The stuff, Tom. Every single day I go to work, I come home, and something has moved. Something isn't where I left it. What, like, envelopes? Envelopes, pillows, it doesn't matter. Tell me she doesn't get in here, Tom. No, she doesn't. Promise me. Leslie was letting tears run like heavy raindrops down her cheeks as she stood in the doorway to the bedroom. Her arms crossed over the front of her scrubs and pulled tight back against her chest. Babe, she does not get in here. I haven't talked to her since December. Promise? Yeah. She didn't say anything in response. Leslie just slammed the door to our room shut, and I realized I was going to be sleeping on the couch that night. I didn't realize I would sleep there for a few more nights. Sleeping on the couch when there are strange shadows surrounding your apartment, and a police officer that has a thing for you and a thing against your girlfriend is uncomfortable. I couldn't lay any which way on the couch without feeling watched, and when I'd get up in the middle of the night and hear a faucet running, my mind began to wonder if there was some way the shadow could be turning the faucets on. And all day long, with Leslie not responding to my texts, I would wonder if she would even make it home or if Tate would wind up with another incident on her record. On the morning of February 8th, Leslie left for work without saying a word a little after 6 in the morning. She slammed the door good and hard though, hard enough to make me wake up from a minor nap that counted towards sleep. A few minutes later, I heard a quick whoop of a siren down the block, but then a long quiet. I shuffled off the couch a little after 7, and as soon as I stood up, I noticed the shadow of the doorframe on the floor of the living room wasn't straight. There was the faintest outline, part of a head and shoulder peeking around the frame. My eyes rose to the door, and nothing was standing there. But the shadow on the floor grew until it was almost a full human shape. Then the faucet started to run in the kitchen. In the corner of my eye, the shadow almost seemed to become more solid, like a small teenage girl, pretending to lift a glass to her mouth. You. I rolled my eyes, realizing I was trying to communicate with a shadow. You want water? The shadow nodded, which was even weirder, that the shadow was trying to communicate back. If I get you water, will you leave? There was no response. Will it, at least, help? The shadow seemed to nod. I think I was hallucinating, honest to God. A few of my friends are convinced it was a ghost, but I was hardly catching any sleep on that couch. So maybe I dreamed about this next part. Maybe I never went into the kitchen to grab a glass of water and set it on the table. Or maybe I did, and I was the one that drank it all. It wouldn't make any sense for me to see a shadow of a woman that could drink water, any more than it made any sense that I had seen several shadows over the preceding months that had no physical correlation to objects. Most likely, I was hallucinating. Just like I was hallucinating when the door jumped against its lock. Maybe not a hallucination, but a dream that it jumped against the lock until I finally opened the door and felt the breeze carry down the walkway. Hallucinations, daydreams, finally were getting to me after months of being on edge. But I wasn't the only one that was on edge that day. Around noon, my phone buzzed on my desk, a notification from the camera system. I was expecting Leslie home early and picked the phone up to check. Sure enough, Leslie was walking down the walkway when a squad car squealed to a stop behind her, and I saw a woman hop out. "Officer Tate." "Stop." I heard Tate's voice through the camera, grainy and faint. "Police." "Why?" Leslie hollered back, turning to look at the officer walking around the car. "This is my home?" "I'm gonna need to see some ID for that, ma'am." Tate drew her gun. "We've received some complaints of sketchy individuals in this area. You gave me a ticket like a week ago." "That I do not recall." Leslie took a step back, and I started walking from my office towards the kitchen, watching as my girlfriend started to reach for her bag while Officer Tate kept her sunglasses trained on my wife. Just as I reached the living room, I saw Tate reach towards her neck abruptly. Her hand wrapped around the front of her throat, and her gun came up and fired, the loud crack of the shot echoing in the walkway and on my phone. I dropped my phone and let out a yelp. "Son of a bitch." I heard Tate cry, followed by another gunshot, and I was scrabbling into the kitchen while 2 more shots went off. I unlocked the door while hunched over on the ground and shouted out, "Leslie, come inside." Shots fired. Tate was shouting, "Officer in need of assistance." Leslie was closer than I thought, apparently just seconds away from getting her own keys out, and she threw herself through the door and curled up on the ground while I looked out. Officer Tate was at the end of the walkway, sitting back against the wall, pointing her gun into air. I shut the door quickly and locked it. "What the fuck?" Leslie breathed. What the fuck happened?" "I don't know." There were sirens in the distance, getting closer and closer. I slithered over to my fallen phone and backed up the camera. On the footage, it appeared that after Tate started choking herself, she began to beat herself across the face and chest with her offhand while firing her gun around the walkway until she finally collapsed on the ground against the wall and aimed the gun in the air. It was enough to make the watch commander shake his head in disgust when we showed it to him, and he did not want to look Leslie in the eye after watching it. The Union tried to sell Tate's version of events, that a mysterious entity attacked her in the walkway, and she was defending herself, likely from a PTSD flashback. However, the district attorney pointed to our video as evidence that there was clearly no entity in the walkway besides Officer Tate and Leslie. She also found it strange that Tate suffered the same injuries at her own hand that she had suffered when she was allegedly attacked by a homeless girl several years before. Fortunately, or unfortunately, Tate's union lawyer got her off of charges of attempted homicide and assault with a deadly weapon by reason of insanity. Apparently, she had been disassembling every faucet in her home and holding cells since the day of the incident, claiming that was how they got to her. The good news was she was very adamant in all of her statements that there was no untoward conduct between her and I. Leslie let me back into bed after the shooting and eventually even apologized to me for making me sleep on the couch. She still doesn't really like cops though. I never saw another strange shadow in that apartment from that day until we moved. But, some nights, I left a cup of water outside the back door, only to find it bone dry in the morning. There's no sense leaving a glass out now. We live in a quiet community just outside a major national forest. Like I said, there are hardly any homeless people. But, at least once a month, I try to make it down to the big city and donate a little time, a little help, and maybe the occasional water bottle. And sometimes, when I'm leaving, I leave a paper cup of water out in the alley.